Equity markets have responded positively to the US Federal Reserve's monetary policy decision on Wednesday, with Asian stocks tracking gains on Wall Street. The Fed kept borrowing costs on hold at a 23-year high of 5.25 to 5.5% and signalled only one rate cut for the year. The decision came just hours after the US inflation reading for May came in cooler than expected, rising 3.3% year-on-year. All three major US indices climbed overnight, with both the S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite closing at record highs. The war on Gaza and Ukraine's financial challenges are expected to headline this year's G7 Leaders Summit. Heads of state from member nations and numerous invited guest countries are gathering on Italy's Adriatic coast for the three-day meeting. It comes at a time when other international groupings are challenging the relevance of the bloc. While economic issues remain a staple of G7 discussions, the current geopolitical climate raises questions about the group's ability to address broader global challenges. From the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and Israel's war on Gaza to the threat of nuclear proliferation and climate change, solving these issues requires collaboration beyond the G7's membership. The legitimacy of the Group of Seven is increasingly questioned, as it represents only a few major democracies, leaving out significant economies like Brazil, India and China. The G7 accounts for just over 26% of global GDP, down from 40% in the year 2000, and represents less than 10% of the world's population. In contrast, BRICS accounts for 36% of global GDP and 45% of the world's population. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has vowed to make this year's G7 more inclusive. Our senior correspondent Melinda Nucifora is in Bari, Italy, with more on this. Melinda, thanks for joining us. Now, given the current geopolitical climate, how is the G7 planning to address these global crises effectively during the summit?
There is so much on this packed agenda, Taibeh, that even if these world leaders weren't under such political pressure, it would be a lot for them to have on their plate. But when you also consider the political pressure on so many of these world leaders currently at the moment, that is adding more intensity to this G7. Some of the topics that they will be discussing are so broad-reaching and so vitally important, not just for the G7, but for global security in general. In particular, there is, of course, the conflict in the Middle East. The G7 leaders released a statement last week ahead of the summit, which kicks off today, saying that they stand behind and fully support the peace plan proposed by US President Joe Biden, and that they are really looking to push for any peace solution that supports a two-state solution. Interestingly, though, they're not really going to be able to do too much besides issue a statement like that. It's on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine where the G7 feels like they could be more effective. And that's because it is expected that the G7 leaders will come to an agreement on how to help Ukraine finance its defence and reconstruction. In particular, the G7 leaders want to harness the profits on about $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets. Every year, those assets, they're things like cash, bonds and other financial assets that are stashed in financial institutions around the world, generate between $3 to $5 billion a year in profit. What the US is proposing is that the G7 issue a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, and the profits from those frozen Russian assets are used to finance that loan. That is expected to be agreed to, and it's a plan that has been a long time in the works. It would be seen as a great success for the G7 leaders.
Right, Melinda, now with the G7's relevance being increasingly questioned, especially in light of rising influence from groups like BRICS, what steps are being taken to make this year's summit more inclusive and representative of global interests?
Well, the host country this year, Italy, the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has really made African development one of the main platforms of her prime ministership. And she's really using this G7 presidency to cement her position as a bit of a global stateswoman. So she has really tried to push African development as a strong platform for this G7. In particular, you'll see even on day one of the very first sessions today is on African development and the challenges the African continent faces with regards to climate change. So all of these things combined for Italy is really a way of addressing irregular migration. Italy has really tried to focus on development goals for Africa, thinking that if those economies are more stable, are more prosperous, young people will want to stay on the continent and work there rather than looking for a better future in other countries, particularly in Europe. So she's invited a lot of African leaders, particularly we've got the leaders from Tunisia joining, and Tunisia is one of the exit points for so many of the irregular migrants arriving in Italy. So, and also Kenya joining as well, Ethiopia. She's really tried to invite some high-profile African leaders as a way of showing that the G7 is not just an elite Western group, that they have concerns for the global south. She's invited Argentina and Brazil's leaders. This will be the first time those two leaders of key global south countries have come together since their elections. And we know that they certainly do not get along. They have vastly different economic policies. It'll be the first time they've been in the same room together. They haven't even congratulated each other after their election victories. So she's really putting a focus on the global south. It will remain to be seen, however, at the conclusion of day 3, whether or not her goals have been successful.
Right, Melinda, we'll have to leave it there. Our senior correspondent, Melinda Nucifora in Italy, there for us.